I'm Chelsea with Pink Door Fabrics, and we are coming to you today in a series of videos to teach you how to English paper piece, which is also the acronym for that is EPP, so you'll hear that thrown around a lot. And we're proud and super excited to bring to you the introduction to our Queen of Diamonds pattern. Many of you have probably already signed up for this through your local quilt shop or an online quilt shop. And they're in production and going to be coming out into stores soon. So we wanted to kind of give you a brief overview of English paper piecing and kind of how to get you started working on this project when you get your pattern, your acrylics, and then your paper pieces in the mail to get started. So we're going to kind of go through a bunch of things, sort of the tools that you'll need, what the pattern's going to look like, how to get started when you receive all of your items and that sort of thing, and then basic English paper piecing tutorials. We're going to do these in a series of videos. So to this first video, we're going to go through how to get started, how to use your acrylic pieces, and how to cut your fabric for your paper pieces and how to baste. So let's get started with that. One thing I do want to mention is Tula Pink has some phenomenal videos that she's done a couple of years ago now for Fat Quarter Shop that live out on the interweb on YouTube. So if you search Tula Pink EPP or English paper piecing videos, there's a series of 3 videos that she did as well that are phenomenal. I learned from her lots of tips and tricks, but she's one of the masters at this, so she did a phenomenal job with those videos, and if you want even more information, you can go to view those. So the one thing I do want to mention is there are a million ways to English paper piece, similarly to the way that you may have learned to sew. Your mom may have done it one way, the quilt teacher that you learned from may do it a different way. No way is necessarily right or wrong. There are lots of purported quilt police out there. But nothing, as long as this works and you get your seams together, really it's one of those things that you find what works best for you. I'll show you the way that we like to do this, or that I've learned and have kind of grown to love this way of English paper piecing. But if you find a different way that works better for you, that's totally fine. Nobody's going to come out and call you out about it. So let's get started. So when you receive your package, you should, if you are doing the block of the month, you're going to receive your pattern booklet, which, don't be intimidated, it's a pretty large booklet. And so we've got the front cover, and then on the inside cover, it's going to show you exactly what the full quilt layout's going to look like. So this is what your final quilt will look like if you follow the pattern exactly as it's written here. So this will be the same as advertised. And then this page, you'll see we've got little block numbers that correspond to each of these blocks. So that'll tell you with the block of the month which blocks you're doing that month. So for instance, this one is going to be block 1-1, which will correspond to this. So then when you open this up a little further, we'll talk about the tools and basting here in just a minute, but we're going to skip ahead to block 1 or month 1, block 1-1. So this is the very first one that we'll be working on as part of the block of the month. For month 1, there are a total of 2 blocks to kind of get you started. So we'll start a little slow and kind of work our way up in terms of complexity. So we'll go through this. And so how you're going to read our pattern here is we've corresponded the templates and the quantities to the fabric. So we've shown kind of a color drawing here of what that block is going to look like. And then here you'll see the full rendering of what it's going to look like in fabric. So if you want to do this exactly as we've made it, we've also put in some of these little pro tips that teach you exactly how to lay out your templates so that the stripes or focal print or fussy cut print of each block will turn out just the way you want it. So, and then this is kind of your assembly diagram of how you're going to put that block together. Again, English paper piecing, because it's hand sewn, you can sew things in a much easier way and kind of create Y seams that would be more difficult to do on a machine. So if you find that it works better for you to create this sort of block together, however you decide to do that, if it works for you, that's totally fine. So what we'll go through is we're going to start with cutting this particular block out. So I'm going to put this down because we've got that here. And so you also should, if you purchase the acrylics, you're going to receive a bag of those. There is, when you receive them, usually some paper on the back of them. That's just to protect them while they're being laser cut. So you've got your bag of acrylics. You'll need to peel that brown paper off, and then you have a clean, clear template with which to work. So you're going to correspond these, and we've tried to make everything really super user friendly. So what you're going to see here is we've got our A templates. So you're going to want to correspond that to your acrylics that are in your bag. So here there's an A on there, and it's noted that there's the 3/8 inch seam. We'll get into that in just a little bit more detail in a few minutes. So you're going to want to get your A template out, your J template out, which is your bigger diamond, and then also your B template. So get all of those out, kind of have those ready to go. And then when you get started in getting ready to cut, it's real easy to just grab those. So those will correspond in each month's sort of layout of which templates are being used. You'll see if they're different. We just listed those out so that you know exactly which ones to grab. And then the second column gives you a quantity of how many of those you're going to need. So just go off of that, and if there are any weird little differences in terms of if one is a mirror image or if there's kind of any sort of special cutting instructions for each of those, we've typically denoted those with an asterisk, and that'll tell you to kind of pay attention to here on how to cut those so that they look just, you know, the way you want them, and fussy cut them so that in this case these lines are going to line up from the top to the bottom and they kind of connect. So we'll go through how to do that. And then your fabric kit that you'll be receiving for your block of the month is going to come in a nice little plastic envelope. I've taken mine out just so that I can show you, but these are the fabrics that you'll be receiving for block 1 for month 1. And so those will correspond again back to the little layout here on each sheet so that you can say, okay, I've got my dot. This lists the SKU number of that fabric. So if you happen to need more, we vastly made sure that you should have plenty of fabric for this, so I don't anticipate that at all. But just in case you wanted to order more, it lists out the SKU on that. And there's an image so that you can correspond the fabrics that you have to the block that you're going to be cutting. So when you get ready to cut that, you're going to take your acrylics. And so there are multiple different ways to do this. Tula has one of her methods is you can just take regular fabric cutting scissors and take this out. I'm going to grab my first fabric just so I can kind of demo this. This one has a little bit of a fold in it. There's no need to iron this. All of this will work itself out when you're English paper piecing. If you feel the desire to, it's not going to hurt it, but there's no need to starch or press your fabric before you cut it. If it's a really, really big crease, you could certainly just kind of, you know, once you lay your template down, it'll kind of fold that out, and then it'll easily, there's no need to do that. It won't hurt the end quilt at all. So what we're going to do, let me back up. I started to say that Tula you can certainly just take scissors. So let's go through a couple of different methods for cutting. So this first one, we've got our tiny dot, which is going to be template A, and we need 2 of those from template A. Now, stripes, it doesn't matter where you're going to cut this. There's no need to say, oh, well, these need to all line up on the little dots or anything. There's certain instances where it does matter where you're cutting that fabric, and you're going to want to pay attention to stripes more than anything, or focal pieces when we get into some of the bigger Everglow focal prints. But dots and solids, there's no need to fussy cut those. You can just kind of go at it wherever it works. So you can do, one method is you could take a friction pen, or this is kind of an air erase pen, and you could, this is a friction erase pen. There's a lot of different opinions about these pens. Some say that they'll come back over time, that they don't fully air erase. If you hit this with heat, that line will disappear. Now, if you were cutting, or if you were drawing in the middle of this fabric, and that's something that you're going to see in the end quilt, I may not do that. But these pieces are merely a place from which you can cut. So there's no worry about those. Even if those lines didn't happen to completely disappear, they showed up as a ghost line later, it's not going to hurt anything because it's going to be on the back of your quilt. So option one would be to take your friction pen, trace around your acrylic, and then cut this with scissors. If you're not super comfortable with a rotary cutter, that would be probably the preferred method to do this. I think it's more time consuming than using a rotary cutter. My preferred method, because I like to do these fast so that I can get to sewing, is to use the rotary cutter, and it's specifically made, these acrylics are, so that you can cut right up to the edge of them with your rotary cutter and just bang out a bunch of these in no time flat. So since we need 2 of these, what I'm going to do, again, if you're just starting out, you could certainly do them individually. There's a certain amount of precision that's required with English paper piecing, but once you've wrapped your paper pieces and gotten those, really the precision comes from aligning those when you go to sew them. So the seam allowance on all of these is 3/8 of an inch. The first version that we made was with 1/4 inch seams, and we really struggled with taking the papers out and then switching to make those machine sashed pieces work, because the thickness of that fabric around the 1/4 inch seams just got a little too skinchy, and it was difficult to make those work. So we went to the 3/8 inch seam because it gives you a little bit more fabric to work with. And then when you take these papers out at the very end, you're able to, you have enough space. We're going to trim these up in the very end, which we'll get to at a later time. But all that to say, you've got 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on all sides so that you can wrap those around and you have plenty to work with. So I would prefer, since you need 2 of these, I would just lay this fabric, take your fat eighth, and I would fold it. Doesn't matter if it's right sides together, wrong sides together, just sides together, and make a double layer of that. And then when you go to sew this, cut this, you can just hold this down with your, I use just 2 fingers right there. You get your, this is a 28 millimeter rotary cutter. I do find for smaller pieces, the smaller the rotary cutter, the easier it is to use. This one's a Clover, and I personally like it because it's kind of ergonomic. Totally your preference, what you decide to do with. The one caveat that I will say is it's difficult to use a bigger 45 millimeter rotary cutter just because you're working in small spaces and you don't want to nick your fingers or cut your fingernails off or anything like that. That would be a bad day. No blood on the fabric. So for this, I'm going to lay these 2 pieces together. I don't know why, it's a habit of mine. I have to stand when I cut, so we'll just jump out of our chair for a minute. So what you're going to do is just hold that template securely. So when you go to cut, I just pick a side, start going, and then this rotating cutting mat from Sue Daly really is your best friend. I can't speak highly enough of them. There are others on the market that are also great. I find these from Sue Daly have ball bearings, and so they turn a lot easier and more smooth than others. So this is why I prefer these. But just as you're going, make sure that your template hasn't shifted and just keep going right around. And then you can turn your rotary mat here and your fabric will kind of come along with you. In a perfect world, you wouldn't have all this junk on your table. But just go all the way around until you've reached the beginning, and then you'll see that you've cut out 2 very nice little A triangle pieces. And so you move your acrylic aside and voila, you have 2 of your pieces all set and ready to go. So you're going to just repeat the same thing. So if you want to make a photocopy of this or just use like a little pencil or whatever works best for you to keep track of this. So we've got our 2 template A pieces cut out. Next is going to be the template J piece. Again, you need 2 of those from the same tiny dot fabric. So same thing again. I think it's easy to cut out 2 of these at a time, especially if you need multiples. For your quilt, it just makes it go a little faster. You're done cutting a little faster. Oh, I realized that one of those had my little lines on it from my friction pen, but it'll come right out. So not a problem. Same thing here. I'll just line up my fabric 2 sides. And just if you do that, make sure that your fabric is, both of those pieces are going to be full pieces from your template. If you get a little short, it could be a problem and one piece won't quite be the same size. So just make sure when you're laying that fabric or doubling it up that you've got enough on both sides of that. So same thing, I think it's super fast to just go right around. And as you can see, it takes hardly any time at all to get your 2 pieces. So now we've got our J pieces. So that's all set. This is all that you need for this particular month from the Tiny Dots. So as you can see, you've got plenty of fabric. In case you're just learning, you make a mistake, you can just move it down and keep going. You should be totally fine. And so then the next piece in our little spreadsheet here is going to be the B tiny stripe in Songbird. So you'll get your fabric, and all of yours are going to be labeled by month. So it should be really easy for you to just grab these out, look at your, correspond it to the pattern, and that way you've got everything ready to go. So this particular stripe, this is where we want to kind of talk about this. So with the dots, we talked about it doesn't matter where you're going to cut those. If they're big dots, then it might matter, but in little tiny dot land, there's no worry to fussy cut those. But when you get to this B stripe, you'll see that we align those so that those are going to run vertically. Some of these design choices that we've made add more to the quilt, because if you just do them willy-nilly, then they can kind of look a little messy or just not add to the overall cohesion of your quilt. So we really tried to make sure to account for those things. So if you see those things, you can just refer right back to our pattern and go, okay. So with this one, you'll notice the B piece, it can go this way or this way. But because this block is mirrored, one of them is going to run with the short side on the bottom, and one of them is going to ride with the short side on the top. So this is the one occasion, if you're good at this and more seasoned of a fussy cutter, you could certainly align these 2 pieces one on top of the other and do that. But let's go through this just kind of the simple way. So these stripes actually work really well in order to line up this template on a stripe, and that way it aligns. Let's see if I can show you this. Yeah, if you line it on one of these corners, this little top corner, it perfectly aligns with the other one, and that way you know you've got that stripe running straight up and down 90 degrees. So that's going to be what we're going to do for this first one. So I'll cut this first one, and if you look at that one, it goes with the big side on the top. So I'll lay that big side on the top and then align my 2 stripes with the 2 corners on the bottom. Go around, cut, go all the way around. I know you're not supposed to cut towards yourself, but I've been doing this for a little while, so don't go crazy. So then you have your perfect piece. You'll see it, those stripes are going to align perfectly on the bottom. This also gives you a little bit of a registration mark when we get ready to base these papers on there. And so then you can align those papers just so, and that'll give you a line where you go, okay, then those stripes will perfectly hit exactly there. So when I go to base this, I'll be sure to mention that again. And then we don't need to cut each and every one of these out, but the next thing, you'll just keep cutting all of these out based on your cutting diagram. The one place where we get a little different cutting, and we want to pay attention to the cutting, is for this Misty tiny stripe. And so this piece, let me go back to my J diagram. These are going to run, we want these 2 stripes to be fussy cut, and because they run vertically or horizontally depending on their orientation, we want those to run diagonally so that they look as though it gives it just kind of an added layer of complexity that's not hard. It makes it seem way more complicated than it is, but those lines are going to connect and make it kind of feel like a chevron. And so when we go to cut those, we've given you this nice little diagram of it says, when cutting, align your template, because one of them is going to be a mirror so that when you flip it down, they'll match up just right. So those ones, we go ahead and show you how to do that. And so for these guys, you're going to take your acrylic and you want your stripes just like in this photo. I would just take your fabric, lay it down just like that so that it's real easy to do that. And I made, let's see, one of these stripes, oops, need to go this way first. Same thing. As long as you line those stripes with the corners of those, everything should line up perfectly when you go to baste and sew. So I'm going to do one of these. Oops, turn. Okay. And then it'll say flip. So what you're going to want to do is, if this is the right side up and I've aligned these just so that they look just like they do in the picture, you're going to flip that over so it's a mirror image of that, so that you get the opposite. If you cut it the same way, you're going to end up with those stripes going the same direction, and so you won't get that sort of chevron appeal where those lines are going to line up. So just take your time. It also helps if you're just learning to mark these out with a friction pen or some sort of air erase pen, whatever works best for you, so that you can go, okay, those, yes, they're, let me turn this way. Yes, they're a mirror image of each other, and when I put those two together, then they should match. So it helps, especially before you cut. If you're new to this and you're not feeling super confident, we'll certainly get you there. It takes a little bit of practice, so don't be so hard on yourself. But once you get to that point, then you're going to be able to look at this and go, yes, okay, that's fine. And then when we go to baste, you can lay all those out. The good thing about basting is we're just glue basting. So you can always peel those pieces back off and arrange them any way you need to, or if it's a little, if your lines aren't lining up super great, you can certainly rearrange those or readjust those so that they will line up. So you're going to go through this when you're making your own quilt to cut all the pieces exactly as we've shown here. We don't add, these sashing pieces until the very end. So we'd show that, but don't worry about cutting those. You'll receive that fabric towards the end of the block of the month. And we put those on by machine. So that's kind of for a future video, future day. Don't get too wrapped up about that right now. So I'm a glue baster. There are two ways to baste. There are thread basters out there. I will not be teaching you that technique because I am not one and I'm not very good at it. And it's really, if you find that it works better, some people like the more portability of thread basting. It's certainly your prerogative and your preference. Doesn't matter one way or another. As long as it's wrapped around the paper, that's all that matters. So let's talk for a minute about the papers that you're going to be getting. So you're going to get a nice big set of papers. I've gone ahead and pulled mine out just so that I can show you this. They are going to be laser cut pieces, and each of your bags will be individually labeled with what shape they are. So for this particular block, you're going to need your A, J's, and B's. And so count up how many total you're going to need of those from your little cutting assistant here, and pull those pieces out of the bags that have those labels on them. You're really going to want to make sure not to separate those in the get them all out of the bags and mixed together, because there are several of the pieces that are the same shape, but one is a larger, one is a smaller, and they can get kind of confusing. So we've tried to make it super user friendly, where just leave your papers in their respective packages with their labels on them until you're ready to use them. So all of these, I've got my B pieces, my A pieces, and my J pieces. And again, I really love the rotating cutting mat for this because it makes it really easy. So forgive my glue pen, it's a total disaster. I haven't yet mastered the art of keeping a glue pen all nice and clean. The one that we use, again, there are many of these on the market. We like the Soline fabric glue pen. It comes with different colors of glue. So I think in the box it comes with blue. There's also yellow. I've heard talk that there's stronger versus not stronger glues. I prefer the yellow. It really doesn't matter. It comes in blue, pink, and yellow. Some they say are better for paper versus fabric. I don't think it matters. As long as it glues and it keeps it down, that's all we're trying to do here. So for the first one, let's go over these easy A pieces because they're pretty easy to do at first. There's a lot of talk about dog ears, and so let me show you. Let's back up and then I'll talk about dog ears in just a minute. So what you're going to want to do is take your A piece, and we've got that all ready to go. So then you're going to take your paper, and I eyeball this. There's no need to get really scientific and precise about it. As long as your paper is wrapped around there, this matters more when you're fussy cutting a piece, which we'll talk about. But for stripes and, or I'm sorry, dots and solids that are not, I lost my lid here, needing to be fussy cut, as long as you're really close and you kind of eyeball it in the center of that, that's great. So you're going to take your glue pen. I leave just about that much up at the top. I end up with glue on my hands occasionally because it kind of rolls over. But you just want to really quick swipe of glue. So I'll hold this up so that you can see it. So you can see I've done a little swipe of glue there. It does dry pretty fast. So, I mean, you've got a good 10-15 seconds to work with, but you just want to fold that up around the bottom. I use my fingers to kind of fold it up, and I like for there to be a nice crease there. There's also different preferences on how tight those should be. You'll find your preference, and you'll kind of work into a rhythm as you do this more. It's going to be probably a little awkward at first, as with learning any new skill, but don't be too hard on yourself. Again, as long as it's glued up and around there and you can get your needle through there when we go to sew, that's all that matters. So then you're going to move to the second side, and so you do want to get just a little bit of glue on that first seam so that this piece of fabric will also hold that piece down. So this is what you call a dog ear, and this piece, don't cut them off. When I first started English paper piecing, I was like, oh no, I don't like those there, they look messy. But if you cut them off, what happens is you've cut off your seam allowance, and that seam is going to open up. These will all nest together in the end, and it will be fine. One thing I was going to mention about dog ears is that there's a lot of, Tula has a little jingle, and it goes, I think it's the way that you based is the way that it will face, is her little jingle. And of course I can't remember it now that I need to recall it. So whichever way you start basting is the way that those will continue to go. It's one of those things that I get into a rhythm with English paper piecing, and I'll probably offend the quilt gods with this, but it's one of those things that I just get into a rhythm, and if I need it to be facing the other direction when I'm doing two pieces together, I can either kind of pull that piece up and rebaste it if it happens to be going the right way, or I just kind of hold them back, and we'll talk about this when we go to sew. Triangles are a little bit of a tricky situation because you're going to end up with little dog ears facing either two ways, or there's a way to make them spin, but you kind of got to half glue aside. That's, you know, the second, that's EPP 102 that we'll get into later, that we can kind of go through that. But as long as this piece, and it should be about that tight, so you'll see we've got approximately the same seam allowance on each of those sides, and that's all that we care about, so that when we go to sew those together, that seam allowance is nicely buried in there and equal on all sides. So that's your first piece. You'll do this for each of these subsequent pieces. Now, when you get to a piece that matters more, that you want those pieces, or that piece in the stripes, to be more fussy cut and to be going a certain direction, we've taken the time to do that when we do the cutting. So we want to make sure that we continue to keep that accuracy when we go to the gluing. So you'll notice these two pieces, these two B pieces, are going to go together. So this is where you may want to pay attention to the way that those guys are going to face, the little dog ears are going to face. Again, I don't think it's the end of the world. You know, in a quilt there are seams that match up. Sometimes you end up with a double seam on one side and life goes on. In the grand scheme of things, it's not going to matter. If you happen to think about it and you go, okay, I should do one of these B pieces so that those seam allowance, or those little dog ears, will go down and these will go up so that they'll nest nicely, that's a worthwhile thing. Again, it's not the end of the world. So for this one, let's just decide that we want those pieces, this top seam, to kind of go down and the dog ears to face out. I'll just do the opposite one for the other B. I don't have all those cut. I don't need to bore you with how to baste every single one of these. And once you get going, it goes really fast. As you can see, the cutting didn't take very much time. The basting takes a little more, but it's one of those things you just kind of sit and turn on a show or listen to something, a podcast, and it goes really quickly. So for this one, where we do care about where those stripes hit, you can see enough through this fabric to see that those two stripes are going to hit that corner of that. So what you want to remember is the piece that or the paper piece is essentially what this paper piece is essentially what your finished block or part of your block is going to look like. So if you want those to align with that, you're going to want to pay attention to keep those aligned. And so same thing with the last one. I'm just going to kind of eyeball this in terms of right, left, top, and bottom. But I'm going to keep those two lines at the bottom really well held in place with my hand while I do this. And I typically kind of fold this over, so a line of glue, and then you kind of work from the center out, and you've got your first side folded. I like to work opposite sides, that way things aren't shifting. So I'll typically do this top side and then come back to this bottom side, just a little swipe of glue, roll this up. I kind of use my fingers to finger press that down. Again, I like them all nice and tight because I have a little ADD, OCD, some sort of obsession with them being tight and nice looking when I English paper piece. These papers are all going to come out in the very end, so I'm sure it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but I like them all to look nice and pretty. You do want a little bit of space, so you don't want to pull that over so that it's stretching that piece of fabric or, you know, making that piece of paper fold behind there, because then it's going to be hard to get your needle through there. So you want just a little tiny bit of space there. And then once I've done the top and bottom opposite sides, I'll come to the other side here. And again, this is where it's a little important to just catch a little bit of glue on those previous sides that you've glued, or those pieces of fabric that you've glued down, so that they will get caught in there. Otherwise they can kind of fold up on themselves. Not the end of the world, but it just makes a little nicer seam when you're finished for all those to lay down. So I've done that side. You'll see the dog ears flipping up right now. I'll switch to the other side here. Same thing, swipe of glue a little bit on that side. And then I kind of hold those down just a little bit, because otherwise it kind of wants to flip, and make sure that those pieces are attached to the bottom pieces, just kind of tacking those in place. So as Tula noted in some of her EPP videos, this, if you glue based and then set them aside, it'll stay there for months. I have yet to find glue that's failed. After some amount of time, I will typically kind of do a bunch of these at once because it's easy. I kind of get into a rhythm with the cutting, and then I typically would make a little Ziploc bag or something and take all the pieces of fabric that I've cut for that, all the paper pieces that correspond to that, and stick them in a bag, mark it with block 1, month 1, or month 1, block 1, just so that then if I'm not going to sit down and sew that day, it's really easy to refer back to that and go, oh, that's that block, and you've got everything all ready to go. Alternatively, you could also just cut all the pieces out, put the paper pieces with it, stick it in a bag, and baste later. So whatever works best for you. Sometimes you get into a rhythm and you feel like cutting that day, so I would cut a whole bunch of them out, and then come back to basting. I really like I said, this rotating cutting mat is a huge benefit, because instead of having to pick up those pieces when you're glue basting them, you can just turn it and you can just keep more pressure on them, so that when you're not moving them. And that matters more when you're fussy cutting, which we'll get into a little bit more. The next video we'll do some fussy cutting and then getting into how to sew these together. So stay tuned for that. But one thing I did quickly want to show you at the end of this was these stripes that we cut, and we want those to mirror one another. So again, we took the time to fussy cut those so that they're correct. And so I would refer exactly to this diagram. I'm a very visual sort of girl, so explaining it versus I literally take my piece and lay this out there so that they match. And now, of course, that I need to do that on video and show you, I'm struggling. So I'll take this piece and you're going to wrap it around this piece just like that. And same thing, you're just going to go, I align those stripes so that they're matching up with those corners, and that way I know that they're going to run, you know, perpendicular or diagonal to whichever way I need them to go. And wrap these around there. So again, with the diamond, I've done 2 opposite sides, again, just so that it doesn't slide. Sometimes what'll end up happening is you'll get more seam allowance on one side and less on the other. Not a huge deal with this, but especially if those pieces are, you're trying to center a motif in there, that matters. So I just think it's easier to do opposite sides, especially for diamonds. And then fold these around and glue them up. As you can see, you don't need a lot of glue, just a quick swipe. It'll make it harder to get those pieces out at the end if you have used a lot of glue. So next time, in the next video, we're going to talk about some of the different blocks and how those are going to be more fussy cut. Let me find one where that happens. So especially, this gets into month 2, but we're going to talk about how to fussy cut each of these little suns from your fabric so that when you go to sew those together, it kind of makes this cool radiating sort of design out from the center block. So we'll talk about how to place your acrylics for that, how to baste for those. This one is a little bit different, similar technique to the one we used to fussy cut these stripes in this first month, on how to get those to align as well. So we hope you'll stay tuned for that, and we look forward to English paper piecing with you.